Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. It's fantastic to see so many people with us already. We're expecting that we may have a few more joining into the session as we progress. Welcome. It's fantastic to welcome you. This is the second day of Psychological Professions Week 2023. This is our main Psychological Professions Network for the South East presentation. My name's Bill Tiplady, Dr. Bill Tiplady. I'm a consultant clinical psychologist and I'm the Director of Psychological Professions for Oxford Health NHS Trust. But I'm also, and today, I'm the co-chair of the Psychological Professions Network in the South East, alongside Adrian Whittington, who also has a role as our national lead. So the PPN, obviously the PPN, we're hosting this event, so it's fair that we should say something about who we are. The PPN is a membership network. We're NHS funded and we exist to represent the voices of the psychological professions and act as a bridge between the psychological professions and the world of policy and delivery in the NHS. We would really encourage you to join us. We've got a regular newsletter, we have blogs, we host events like this one. So if you're interested in that, hopefully you'd have seen the link to join us. So in terms of today's session, so those who've joined before Professions Week will know that for the last couple of years we've had EDI focused sessions, drawing largely on the work that Margot Onanaye has been doing with us as our widening participation lead. Some of you will have seen the session yesterday morning about the equity and diversity position statement that the Psychological Professions Network has released. If you haven't, that's well worth checking out. That's another session with a kind of southeast route to it. But today we wanted to focus on this theme of how do we work best with the LGBTQIA plus community, and credit for the initial idea there goes to Beth, who you'll see on screen here, one of our experts by experience. We're really proud in the PPN in the South East of our way of working with our experts by experience. And when Beth came up with the idea that this would be a suitable topic for this year, we grabbed hold of that, and that's led us to the session that we're going to present to you today. So I hope that comes across well. Beth will say a little bit more in a moment about the first video. And we sort of realised along the way that this is especially fitting because today is Trans Awareness Week, and Monday is the Trans Day of Remembrance. So we didn't plan it like that, but actually that sort of worked out well in terms of how we're showcasing this really important subject. I'm going to say something in a minute about some of the barriers to accessing healthcare which people from the LGBTQIA plus community face, and then we've got two video presentations coming up, and then a conversation with Professor Allàn Laville, who I'm really delighted is joining us here in person. And then, as I say, at the end, we'll have time to take some questions. But first of all, I guess I wanted to acknowledge that, you know, whilst we hope today's session is an engaging and inspiring one, there's no getting away from the fact that some of the disparities and discrimination faced today in this country by people due to their sexuality or gender identity is very real, sadly very much ongoing, and a source of a very great deal of fear and distress. We're going to be talking about this today, so you'll hear people talking about their mental health and distress, as well as some discussions of difficulties accessing services, some references to suicidal thoughts. So I just wanted to flag those things up front. And I suppose the other thing I wanted to say is, you know, we're talking here about a massively diverse community, so we're not going to be able to speak to everybody's experience, you know, nor are we really trying to do that. We're offering some snapshots of experience. We hope you'll find that really useful, but I'm sure there's lots of aspects that we won't be able to cover. So let's talk a bit about the facts. If we go on to the next slide, we just wanted to talk through some of the kind of key facts and kind of orient ourselves a little bit here. And I mean, what I'd say right at the start is that learning more about this stuff for me has been a really important part of my journey as an ally in this field. I was lucky enough to be part of a kind of training organised by Jamie Willo, who you're going to hear from a little later, in our own trust, where we've been putting together an initiative between the suicide prevention strategy work of the trust and the LGBT staff network in the trust, and we all train together in Jamie Willo's training package. So I think learning about some of the key facts that are still very present in relation to the LGBT community is a really important part of allyship and of improving practice. So healthcare discrimination. So almost 1 in 4 LGBT people, LGBT was the language used in the Stonewall report in 2018, have witnessed discriminatory or negative remarks against people from that community by healthcare staff. So 1 in 4 people, in as a contemporary statistic, we looked at whether there was anything more recent than this Stonewall report. And actually, I think because of the way that lockdown has come in between, the Stonewall report still is probably the most recent, really authoritative report on some of this. So, I mean, I think it's shocking. And I think that's a real cause for concern. If we go on to the next slide. 1 in 8 LGBT people aged 18 to 24 said they've attempted to take their own life in the last year. So we know that being a member of the LGBT community is a risk factor for suicide for all sorts of reasons, many of which have their roots in discrimination of one sort or another. And I think, again, that's a really important statistic. This is a group of people that need the sort of support and help that we can offer in the psychological professions. In terms of trans identities in particular, so 1 in 5 people in the trans community have experienced kind of pressure to suppress their gender identity, so not kind of bring that into the forefront when they're accessing healthcare services. And I think that's something which we heard from experts by experience as part of putting this session together, and something that I'm aware of from the contact I've had with many trans people over time, is that the door just doesn't feel open to having a conversation about this. It doesn't feel that this is something that can be openly put on the table in your interaction with health professionals, and that's something which is a barrier because people are then not able to bring their whole selves and be understood as a whole. Let's go on to the next slide. And then this is another piece of research by Transactual, finding that 14% of people said they'd been refused GP care, 70% had experienced transphobia from their primary care provider, and then 57%, so well over half of trans people have said they'd put off seeing or chosen not to see their GP. So I suppose that feeds us through to the impact of what people experience, that actually that gets in the way of people accessing the healthcare that they should be entitled to, and they should be able to access, with confidence that their whole selves will be appreciated, and that the person they see will be ready to have whatever sort of conversation about their sexuality or gender identity as might be relevant. So that sort of sets the scene, I think, a bit for us, that, we wanted to emphasize that, there's a reason why we're focusing on this, and that is because actually there are real issues in terms of people's experience of accessing both mental health care and healthcare in general, and that has a real impact on people's experiences and ultimately people's health outcomes. So this is a really important area for us to focus on, why we're focusing on it today. So we're going to go now into our first video presentation. I'm kind of pleased to say, in a way, that I haven't been part of putting this together. It was really led on by a group of experts by experience, including Beth, who's with us now. So Beth, I'm going to hand over to you to say a little bit about this video.
Thanks, Bill. Yeah, so this upcoming video is like a collaboration with several members of the community. So the really very beginning of this event planning, we asked several people we knew if they'd be interested in sharing their experience and their stories surrounding getting mental health care as a member of the community. And we were looking at both good and bad experiences, what could be improved, that sort of thing. And that resulted in eventually 2 quite long sessions discussing this. There was lots of really good points. Unfortunately, we did have to condense it down thanks to some very, very amazing video editing by somebody on our team. But yeah, so what you'll see shortly is a condensed down version, but we've gotten all the important points. Not that the rest of it was important, but the most key points condensed down. Yeah, and this is definitely a labor of love. it touches on what I think is a lot of like important points that I think will be helpful to people in learning to improve their practice when it comes to like the community and just general more awareness. So yeah, I hope you enjoy the video, and yeah, I'm really proud of it. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Luke. I identify as transgender queer. I transitioned over 15 years ago. My pronouns are they or her.
I'm Beth. I work with Psychological Professions Network as an EBE. I am queer. You know, I've been very lucky, but I know other people haven't been so lucky, and I feel very passionately about the queer community and LGBT plus people getting the care that they deserve.
I'm Allàn, identify as a trans woman. I'm a member of the Service User and Carer group at Surrey University Psychology Department, a mixture of good, bad and different psychological service experiences, and hopefully we'll get to talk about those.
Hi, my name's Delphi. My pronouns are they, them. I identify as non-binary, transgender, agender. Pick your non-binary phrase of choice.
I'm Nicola. I identify as queer, pansexual mainly. I'm Delphi's partner.
It's been a tremendous boost to me as a person, to my mental health, to stop hiding and be expressive of who I am, just to have that kind of official acknowledgement. I go about my new life free from addiction, in recovery, and then of course after a few more years I get a bit more comfortable with who I am. Very much a young feeling in a middle-aged body. As I started to enjoy my identity and assert it. When I tried to represent trans interests in my trade union, I was kind of excluded a little bit and challenged them. There were some people who welcomed me, and they were in the lesbian and gay group. They encouraged me to represent the views of bi and trans people, and eventually we succeeded in a national campaign to change their fundamental rule book. And it was at that stage, really, that I encountered views that were entirely opposite to mine from other trans people. And I was a bit unhappy being the only voice. Early on, we adopted an approach that I suggested of looking at what we have in common. And so it's in that sense that I use community. So the validity of it to me is that more than a dozen things that we all had in common in terms of the difficulties we encountered, the positive attributes that we had, and so on. I would say I do share in a community of interests, and it's not wise to conflate us all under a label and then assume, because you've met one of us, that you know all of us. It's like I say, when you met one trans person, you met one trans. When you met one autistic person, you met one autistic person, and so on.
So I was making trailblazing by being a trans intersexual person, which was how the medical profession kind of understood it, and a very different experience of what was available then from mental health services if you were going through a GIC, gender identity clinic. I've suffered with consciously with depression since puberty, but did not have a bipolar level 2 diagnosis until my late 40s, really, and then in my mid 50s had a diagnosis of Asperger's, and I feel like these three all come together. And it'd be interesting to share some of my experiences, both positive and negative. Thank you.
For me, it's just, you know, I am myself. I don't necessarily go around every day going, yes, I am part of this community and I must like present it all of the time. But of course, in certain situations, it can come up, like with family. There's some family that don't really understand it. There's always those worries. as well as if I ever encounter anybody who's against the community, that's quite hurtful. I've been lucky enough to find a good community of people. I've got a lot of friends. It's one of those immediate, oh my God, we have this thing in common. It's not a perfect community. We still have our issues. I think overall it can be a really, really just lovely sense of togetherness at times. And that is quite positive. And with being able to fight for things continually for more improvements, that can be quite fulfilling as well, even if it can be a bit taxing on the mental health sometimes.
I only recognize myself as being non-binary within the last few years. So in that sense, a lot of it's still new. On the one hand, it's great because, oh, that's who I am. Yes, now that makes sense. Yes, great. A lot of things clicking into place, but there's still so much trauma and cycles of thinking that are built into growing up wearing the mask of a cisgender person. It is a big deal. For me, it's a huge deal. One of the biggest deals for me, because it's been life altering. A lot of it feels like kind of going back to square one. And obviously this came around the same time that I realized and was diagnosed as neurodivergent, ADHD and autism. It's weird being 35 years old and feeling like you're starting from scratch.
Seeing the impact that like news stories and media and new policies that are coming out from governments, it can have quite a damaging impact, I'd say, because everything can be so tricky on the outside to at least have a place which is more friendly, more accepting. A lot of the times it's that you have a kind of a shared look, a shared knowledge, a shared reference of experience. And that's something you can bond over. I have a lot of passing privilege, so people don't presume that I'm on the LGBTQIA community. So I do think sometimes it can be slightly awkward when people lower their inhibitions and express freely what they think of particular issues to do with the LGBT community. And then there's that expectation of, well, how do I respond? To be honest, it makes me more wary.
Really, my best experience came out of a bad experience, which was so bad that my GP intervened and said, look, you've really got to do better to the service I was engaged with. And as a result of that, I was allocated a psychologist with a very fine reputation who was very, very helpful. We just explored for several sessions, not with any particular angle or any particular model or any particular approach, but just to generally find out about me as a person. What worked well was that there was no sense of, no, we can't go there, no, we can't talk about that. It was whatever surfaced, and she was quite subtle in the way she brought things to the surface so that I would realise them. She might have already realised some of these things about me, but was very careful, caring to bring forward my awareness, not just her technical skill and her appreciation of what was going on with me. She knew I had complex trauma long before I did. So we spent quite a long time to bring me forwards and for me to be able to say who I was, what my story was, the conflicts that I was experiencing. And probably the only thing that could have been done differently was not to have such a time limit on the first round. But we had plenty of time. She kind of stretched the boundaries of what her mandate provided for her. The practitioner was open and affirming, but also curious and offering reflections. And what made it a good experience for me, they listened, they weren't negative about any aspect of my identity. They didn't label it as a cause of mental health problems because it has been the solution for me. And they adapted as well. Whenever I think of that practitioner and the work we did together, her utter respect for me was confirmed in various ways through emails, reports, and so on. Her style of asking me what I would prefer to do, how the sessions ought to go, what my goals were, what the plan should be, the methods that we use. She respected not just me as a person having an individual mental health problem or set of problems, but also as a professional person myself. she looked at me like I was a whole person with a history and experience that was valuable, like a prize.
The few times it has come up, they haven't made like a big deal out of it, which is like a bare minimum thing, but they haven't been insensitive or anything. Being able to at least have a practitioner who is supportive, even if they're not necessarily knowledgeable, they at least try, like seeing an effort. Or I'm not really knowledgeable on that sort of thing, but you know, I will do my best to understand you and learn. If I had to like have an experience like that, it'd be like understanding, willingness to learn, even if they don't know about it, versus coming at it with ignorance and closed-mindedness. My experiences have been fairly neutral because I'm very lucky that it hasn't really had to come up. A lot of people just assume that I'm straight, and it's not necessarily something that I have to deal with.
I've always found it much easier to be open and honest to people and to therapists when they do ask that question. There isn't that presumption. Then they haven't just seen you and presumed a whole bunch of factors. They've actually gone in and tried to meet you as a person, as who you are. You can tell that they're personally invested and that they will change and moderate things based on your needs and based on the reality of your situation. And I think that reality is easier to talk about with someone who at least sees the issues in society, or like sees the problems that people come across, and you don't have to spend 45 minutes explaining how some people have been attacked in a homophobic attack in London, why that could be impactful upon you. It's that shared language.
15 years ago, when I went to the GIC, it was after I had tried to take my own life. And I think that was a factor that made the counsellor there, I was very lucky, who worked with me for 4 years, take my gender dysphoria very seriously. I also had a bisexual history, throwing that in the mix. But at the time, if you were being involved with the gender identity clinic, you did not have separate mental health services. That was because then your gender dysphoric incongruence was considered a mental health problem. Now that's been changed. So what I can say is really positive is that if you're going to the GIC, you can get separate mental health services. For trans people, that's a very good thing. But really, the bottom line is it's whether there's any funding available or any services in your area. I was so lucky because I had 4 years counselling in the gender clinic. What I'm aware of now is it's taking people years to even be on waiting lists and even access the gender clinic. I'm very lucky because I'm in a surgery in Brighton that does have a trans doctor, and now I have a trans annual review. Well, I'm supposed to have a mental health annual review. Obviously, during lockdown, everything went very pear-shaped for everyone. But when I actually ended up in A&E trying to take my life in 2020, there was absolutely nothing. There was no mental health service now. And 3 years later, I had my first mental health review, and it was just bare questions off tick boards. And the person who was doing it was condescending to they wanted me to be pleasant, but they were congratulating me for being able to just say my name or where I lived, or and sort of saying, oh, fantastic. It was so surreal. Anyway, thank goodness I had a better trans health review. I'm sorry, but something a bit humane would be good.
I've got a bit of a list here. I've already mentioned labelling my identities as a cause of mental illness instead of a solution for me. In general, not listening nor appreciating the experiences that I'm expressing, the difficulties I've had getting clinical or social support, the impact that's had, contribution to trauma, the lack of really a trauma-informed approach, which kind of reinforces the internalization of lots of different negative responses throughout my life and generally acts to suppress who I am, which kind of reinforces any mental health problems. The biggest issue for me is people have automated themselves like an algorithm and come across as impersonal. So they're not responding to me anymore, they're following a routine. They're not responding to me as a person.
What people just really do not seem to get is just how much of a life or death struggle this is, because you are so alone. First of all, it's a series of microaggressions and micro-traumas that we experience on a daily basis. Rarely does it come to the fore so much as when we're seeking life-saving help. So first of all, gender, anything outside of the binary is treated as an inconvenience to the person treating. You see it when you correct someone misgenders you in the shop. It's the eye roll, it's the vibe that you get that, oh, this is just going to make my day inconvenient, more difficult. It's not technically illegal, but it's not accepted. It's still seen as being wrong and being out of the ordinary by the establishment. That stuff, not to speak of all the literal hate crimes being performed, that stuff has a cumulative knock-on effect on everyone, especially kids, young people, and none of that is taken into account. None of the experiential things are taken into account. Well, first of all, there's always the anxiety. How much am I going to have to educate this person? You know, how they do studies where, you know, how many people of color don't seek therapy because there are no therapists of color that they can see. It's that thing of like, you want someone who hasn't just understood where you're coming from in an intellectual capacity or theoretically, but they've lived it. You don't have to do all that translating. You don't have to work to find that shared language. It's just there. That example that Nicola used, if there's a homophobic attack someone, I don't want to have to explain to someone why that's so upsetting for me. My key negative experience was we'd moved and I was in mental health crisis. I was feeling suicidal and pretty manic for an extended period of time. And I called the local crisis team and they sent around a crisis worker to chat with us. It was kind of clear from the outset that she just didn't get it. And this was kind of proven right when we got the written report that she typed up. She misgendered me throughout. She said, he says that he is pansgender and pansexual. Pansgender isn't a word in any way, shape or form. She hadn't listened and she hadn't taken it in. It was incredibly disheartening. It thoroughly and irrevocably broke my trust in that local crisis system. I was like, I'm never going to use this service again because of this experience. And you need to do better. And it does so much more harm than just not being able to intervene in the moment. Kind of compacts, grows that feeling, that certainty that the established society does not care, and doesn't care if I live or die, doesn't care whether I can thrive in my own life. What it makes me think is I struggle a lot with mental health, but I have gone through a lot and I can survive it, and I pick myself up and I have a wonderful partner that supports me and I have a great therapist. So I'm doing okay in that sense. But what if it's someone not me? What if it's a kid who has no one to talk to? What if it's an older person living by themselves who doesn't have a community? What does that kind of intervention do? I'll tell you what it does. It leads to suicide. It leads to self-harm. It leads to further isolation. It's damaging. It's not just irresponsible, it's harmful.
If you want to engage with us, then call us in. We'll tell you what's not happening that really needs to, what's happening that should not happen. But it's about, to me, promoting relationships of care rather than going through processes. That's what works well, when the person is obviously committed, personally engaged, personally present, personally upset with upsetting circumstances, personally joyful about joyful kind of reflections that I bring forward. I don't need to explain the history of repression of homosexuality, its criminalization, and all the different negative experiences, and then the whole thing being hauled back over the coals with Section 28. You know, I don't want to explain all that and why I'm so still angry about it, in a less than helpful position to receive therapeutic interaction. I think practitioners need to appreciate that everyone they see has had their own experiences, and some of those have been made a positive contribution to our lives, and some we've experienced as damaging. It's when people don't offer insight, or they leap straight away to what do you think you want to do about it. I'm hoping for them to be open and brave enough to volunteer something of themselves, their insight. And I think that what they need is a system that pays attention to us, monitors, provides data about different minorities so that they can sharpen their expertise. They also need to engage with community agencies and with individuals with lived experience. And that should inform their reflective practice, because I want things to improve and change.
I think if mental health services can actually be able to signpost people to a variety of things, whatever's available, whether it's queer support agencies, autism support agencies, well-being in nature, that team effort, and that's going to be vital, because there is this core issue of, really, we were all aware that the mental health services are at the bottom of the funding pot and the NHS is struggling massively. So I'm very aware of that. And obviously, at some level, I accept it, but it's not great to be just kind of, here's your antidepressants, now go and carry on with it. Really, it's about looking at the more holistic approach. I think that is, so essential for anyone with any identity. For myself, my experience, really, my most challenging thing is the autism factor and that need for solo one-to-one interaction. And so I was so lucky. I mean, my 4 years of counselling in the GIC was with a trans woman. How lucky was I? But if it would just not work to be only offered 6 or 12 sessions, that just is not it. And through the Claire project, so lucky, I had 7 years of seeing a counsellor at a reduced rate because that was funded. I think more options for one-to-one for people who cannot deal with group stuff. Now doing work in a forest garden and being outdoors is helping me so much more, and I can kind of interact with the group when I'm able to be out. So that is kind of key. But of course, it would come down to funding, but that would be the ideal. There's a choice of group services and also individual for those who need it, over a longer period.
From a practical point of view, when I first engage with a service, it would be great to know if they have any LGBT experience within their team. Like if there's someone who's a member of a team who is part of that community, that would be cool to know. I like that the NHS uses Rainbow, but is this because it's a safe space for LGBT people? And if it is, then I'd like a more explicit thing. So I think some sort of signposting to show that they have had some sort of training. Like everyone said, we don't need to re-explain the wheel to them. We don't need to educate them on why some things will hurt. I think therapists and psychological professions need to understand LGBT people. There's a million micro cuts a day, from misgendering or someone saying, "Sir, how can I help you in the shop?" or those past experiences with psychological professions. And all of those things have contributed to create a wall, a barrier, which can come across as being standoffish or going in feeling wary because of all of these things that have happened to you in the past. I think it's important that the person that you're speaking to is also aware of that and acknowledges it, and you have the same shared reality. I also think it's important not to be presumptuous, to ask people how they want to be referred to.
You need to have a more diverse intake, more diverse number of people doing the training, and more diverse people getting the training who are part of various communities. You need people of colour, you need people who are members of the trans community, of the lesbian community, the gay community. We need other people like us to talk about mental health issues. It's no good whatsoever to be talking to people who have no idea where we're coming from. So people's experiences, which yes, you can't train, you are going to end up having more people who have actually experienced trauma, who have experienced these issues. And they're the people that should be getting this training. They're the people that should be being pushed up to work with the community, because that experience is worth more than any amount of book learning you can get. We don't value people's lived experiences, we value their qualifications. The people that will have suffered these traumas, that have this experience, are from marginalized communities who do not get those opportunities. I think it's most important for individual therapists and practitioners is courage. You need to have courage. You need to have the conviction in your own abilities that you can sit there and be in the trauma, because some of the trauma that people of our community go through is so deep and so raw and has never been explored. They need to have courage.
There really does need to be a more targeted approach when it comes to training on how to deal with us. Basically, like Delphi said, you don't really want to have to educate the person that's supposed to be treating you. Not necessarily saying that, you've got to have extensive knowledge of every single identity and every single sexuality, but even just like the basic knowledge and doing just a little bit of research, reading things from actual queer individuals, and just doing a little bit of, I think psychological professionals anyway should be constantly trying to update their knowledge. Mental health and medical stuff in general is constantly advancing, and there's more and more stuff that you should be updating yourself on. First of all, can we have some specific training in the same way that there is training for sensitivity towards racial and religious differences, just even most basic of knowledge? And then I guess more of an emphasis on whatever your own opinions might even be, approaching whoever you're treating with empathy and respect and an open mind, rather than just being like, well, I have this opinion and I'm going to stick with it. As a result, treat you as subhuman. It would be nice if psychology professionals would show that they care a little bit more. I know it can be very exhausting to care, but we don't have the choice to not care, and it is having a massive impact on us.
It's a great privilege to have these kind of 90-minute slots, because it means we can reach lots of people. But this, I guess, is where we sort of hit the constraints of this, because we could spend a whole day, I think, kind of going through, thinking about what we've heard there, hearing people's reflections on it. I can see the claps and hearts and thumbs up coming up from the bottom of the screen there. So I hope that we need to package that and send that back to our EBEs. I think some of whom are with us in the audience, but not all. I can see loads of hands going up. I'm afraid we can't take, we don't have time to take people's thoughts in that way. Please put questions and comments into the Q&A and we'll be able to come back to them at the end of the session. So a big thank you from us to Nicola, who both appeared in the video and edited it. So I think, real appreciation and credit for that. And of course to Delphi, Luke, Eleanor and Beth, who contributed their thoughts and their perspectives in such a clear, accessible but really hard-hitting, I guess, and way. I suppose the thing I take from that is as a psychological professional myself, just how important it is. We have a position of power in the interactions that we have with people who use our services, and I think with that comes a duty that we find ways of putting issues of difference and diversity on the table, actively demonstrating that we're informed about them and ready to talk about them and bring them into the work that we're doing with people. I suppose that leads us into this question of training. A couple of people in that video talked about the importance of people receiving training, and that kind of links us in to the next section of video that we're going to show you. So that's myself and Beth in conversation with Dr Jamie Willo. Now, Dr Willo is a Darcy Fellow, a child and adolescent psychoanalytic psychotherapist, so they're a psychological professional themselves. They work in Sussex Partnership Trust as the Transgender Training Pathway Lead and the Gender Identity Awareness and Inclusion Training Lead, and they also offer their training externally to a range of other NHS trusts and organisations. As I said at the beginning, I've been through Jamie's training, and I enjoyed it, but also, it was tough at times in an important way, and I learned a massive amount from it, both from the content and the experience of being part of a group of people going through it. So we wanted to talk to Jamie to hear about their experience of delivering this training out there in the NHS. So let's start this next piece of video. Thank you. Jamie, thank you very much for joining us today. So I suppose for people to get a sense of who you are, perhaps you just want to start by telling us a bit about your work in this space, what your journey has been, and the sorts of things that you've been doing.
Great, yes, will do. Hello. So I am a child and adolescent psychoanalytic psychotherapist by trade. I've worked for Sussex Partnership for about 15 years in CAMS. And my story is that I very early on recognised there was no care pathway for trans young people, trans non-binary young people and their families in CAMHS. And I became very passionate about this, and I tried to get an all singing, all dancing care pathway off the ground, and basically failed at every turn. So I spent a lot of time in my own time actually trying to work out how to do this. And I had senior leadership backing. We had funding for a while. The funding fell through. It was very, very frustrating. So I got a bit miffed by this after a couple of years of trying, and I thought, right, what can I do? How can I make a difference to the LGBTQ community? And I stepped off my day job and I did a Darcy fellowship. So it's like I did a big leadership project just to I wanted to be taken more seriously, and I wanted to find out why it wasn't happening. And actually looking back in, I recognise that a single clinician working in silo couldn't actually change the world as I had hoped to do. So I reined myself in, which is incredibly hard for me to do. Anyone who knows me would know that. And I looked nationally and locally and what do we need? How can I help? How can I use my training, my experience, etc. And I recognised that staff around me were kind of struggling with, oh, there's a trans person. What do you do with them? You have them, Jamie. You like working with trans people. And I was like, you know what? They're human. It's okay. They don't bite. So I thought, okay, I'm going to devise alongside Health Education England. Actually, I was working with them at the time, and I devised some training. And I wanted it to come from a very kind place, and I wanted it to be very informed and informative. So I developed a training package, which originally was like a big, I say it's like a big hug, so that people could come in, not feel worried about anything, and feel safe enough to have a safe space to talk about things, get those conversations started, and to learn the basics. Once they kind of attended that, I then did another one, which is kind of more mental healthy based, thinking about our roles, how we could be more, an LGBTQ ally as a whole, as a team, as a service, etc. And then I actually did a third one, which was alongside the suicide project that we had going in Sussex partnership. So this was kind of a suicide awareness add-on for LGBTQ people, because they're not really mentioned particularly in our suicide packages. Now, as I say, I come from a very kind place. Some say too kind, but I think you can't be too kind. I think kindness meets kindness. Some of the staff I was talking with were kind of saying, well, people come to us and they're really kind of aggressive, or they're really defended. And it's like, well, I wonder why. Let's have a look at that. So in a kind way, we would all kind of open those conversations. And basically, long story short, people found it useful, the training. Other trusts and other organisations got wind of it, because we don't currently have another me in the NHS. And so people have been buying it in from us, which is great, because it pays for my role completely and utterly. So then I was able to kind of do a good old business case and say, you need me in the trust. So now I'm a fully fledged member of Sussex Partnership again. And I feel like I'm actually making a difference. I've trained thousands and thousands of staff over the last maybe 5-6 years. And everyone kind of seems to take something good from it. And people then feel more able to work with LGBTQ people, and they feel more confident, more empowered, and that has a knock-on effect with our patients. So I'm happy. I feel very privileged to be in this position, actually.
Like you said, you've made a difference. Like, what impact specifically do you feel like you've managed to have here?
I think I always ask people to leave feedback, and a lot of people do. And I guess, if it's bad, if it's good, if it's anything, just let me know, because then I can tweak it and make it a better training. And people have, look, everyone who's left feedback basically has always said it's really helped. I feel that I can attempt to use language, and the kind of the learning points for them is it's okay to make mistakes. I can do that. I just need to be curious, need to be an ally, kind of, be able to put myself in someone else's shoes. And people have said they have felt empowered when, they will approach people, which they wouldn't have done before. They wouldn't have been brave enough to do it, kind of thing. And I think I use a lot of personal anecdotes. I use a lot of lived experience examples. And I think it really makes people feel at ease, it makes them feel comfortable. And then we have these lovely questions coming up and conversations get started. And I think that's what gets carried forward, where they then take the conversations back to their teams or their professional organisation or wherever they are. And I think that's what is making the difference, because people are talking about it. people are understanding what we need to do, and kind of realizing that there are, the NHS is absolutely wonderful, but there are pockets that need to improve. And I think, I've certainly had personal experiences, as have lots of my friends and, colleagues, where, it could have been a bit better, the as a patient, how they were received. So I think I feel like I'm spreading the word that, everyone who comes to the training does the work, but I can facilitate that for them. I think that's where my psychoanalytic training comes in really handy, because I make people feel safe enough to be able to have those conversations. And I think that's where it all begins.
And I think, it seems to me that one of the strengths, I suppose, of what you can bring is different intersecting identities, maybe, but particularly being someone who's got your training as a psychoanalytic psychotherapist, child psychotherapist, but also your own experience of being a trans person and what that has brought to your life. What's it been like, negotiating those different identities and roles?
An interesting one. I think, as far as my psychological profession goes, I've kind of sat through a lot of Freudian lectures, and that was quite tricky, I think, as part of the LGBTQ community. And it really, but I took it to my kind of psychoanalysis that we all had to have. And I think it was very useful, and lots of good conversations, I think, came out of that too. So I think I've become a stronger person with all the training I've done, but I've also become a bit more insightful about the world and about myself within that world. I think I wrote a doctorate. I did a doctorate looking at the function of my profession working with trans young people in CAMS, and I found it incredibly interesting that actually the function is largely the same with about working with the whole person, etc., etc. However, I think it's so important to have some to either have some training, some great training, or some psychologically informed training. I think it's very important to be able to understand the whole of the person that's before you. I think that's what came out in the research that I did, was that actually have a little look at queer theory, have a little look, try and understand from a different perspective, be able to put yourself in your patient's shoes. And I think so I think my profession, it's not about my profession as a whole. I think it's about individuals within the profession, and them kind of trying to get some education and then kind of just understand more, just the basic idea of putting your pronouns on your email signature is, if you're a new person coming into the NHS, if you see that, if you're trans non-binary, for instance, you will feel safe and you will give your whole self in that first interview or the the process, the initial process. If there's nothing around, if it's not visible, if you don't see anyone wearing a lanyard or a badge, or there's no posters, or there's no gender neutral toilets, or there's no signage anywhere, you're I'm a patient, we're all a patient. If I go into a new building, I might hold a little bit back if I don't see anything, just in case, because you never quite know, even in the NHS, what an individual might kind of respond to you like. A lot of people within the community have had kind of experiences of this way. So I think it's about being visible, it's about being an LGBTQ ally, it's about getting yourself educated, and hearing from some lived experience, asking those questions, not assuming, don't make the assumptions that everyone's going to be straight and cisgender, because they might not be. Even if they look very stereotypical, they might not be. And I think that's what trips people up. People are generally kind, especially working in the NHS. But I think people get very worried about making a mistake, walking on eggshells. Therefore, they withdraw and they maybe don't ask those questions. But I think it's important to be brave enough to do that. But again, you're not going to, if you haven't spoken to LGBTQ person, or you don't understand trials and tribulation of language, it can be very, very daunting. So I totally get it. So that's why you need some kind training, which is what I developed. That's what I did.
You work in psychological professions. We have worked psychological professions. To you, do you think, what does good look like when it comes to delivering, good mental health care to people in the LGBTQ plus community?
So the first word I would use is kindness. The second word I'd probably use is understanding. So in order to be able to understand where they're coming from, because actually you look at the statistics for LGBTQ people, they're not great in the UK or anywhere actually, but suicide rates very, very high, although we don't get the data, so we can't do anything about it, but we do know that it exists. Mental health can really deteriorate with lack of access to services, lack of understanding people, being kind, that kind of thing. So I think it's it's very important to be supportive, make sure people feel valued, and make sure you understand what people need, and know what the access barriers are and trying to work with your colleagues to get around those barriers.
I suppose, as you said, we know that there's lots of people who still, today have experiences of NHS care which are not as they should be, and that includes mental health and psychological, the psychological component of care. And we've probably heard about some of those other experiences in some of our other presentations. What do you think gets in the way of that? Whether specifically in the psychological professions or more generally, what is it that actually are the obstacles to us making more progress in being more, creating a better experience for all of our community?
I think it's because we're all very socially programmed human beings, and we don't necessarily know that we are. We don't think about it. The only time you think, if you've always been the majority in a space, you probably never have to think about it. If you've ever been a minority, and that's LGBTQ, or it could be any of the protected characteristics, if you've been that minority, then you will hear things differently, or people will say different kind of things to you, thinking it's okay when actually maybe it's not. People have different expectations of you when maybe that's not what you are all about. So I think it's very important that we know that we come from a heteronormative, cisnormative viewpoint, standpoint, perspective, etc. And I know my own profession comes from that perspective, but I think you need to be able to think outside a box. You need to be able to think not everybody's the same, and that's the only way really that you're going to be able to move forward and become more of an ally, I think.
It's almost something about creating more space, I suppose, for us to hear people's different experiences, to hear, what is it like actually coming from this perspective, from this minority position, or of course people often have different identities that sort of come together in different ways, and maybe we just haven't enough of that.
I think it's about having the time, isn't it, to make sure there's time for some safe space for these conversations to be had, where people actually genuinely feel safe. I mean, I think a lot of patients don't feel safe to use our services. I've interviewed young people. Obviously, I work with young people, and a lot of them were almost hissing at me when I said I was from CAMHS, and I said, why do you feel like this? And they were like, because you don't get it. You just tick boxes, and you don't understand me, and you ask, you're not very kind. So that I'd rather not use your service, which is awful to hear as a clinician, as a psychotherapist, and as a human, I think. And I've certainly had some experiences in my own being a patient. You think of cervical screening. You think about, I've had situations where GPs have kind of been really awful to me, and I've kind of, just being very dismissive and no, it's, load of rubbish kind of thing. And okay, I'm big enough and ugly enough to kind of cope with that. But I always think with my patient, one of my vulnerable patients went in there, they probably never go back again. So I think it's so important. But then, I'm not demonizing GPs. I think, I've trained a load of GPs, and they're always very, very thankful that I've come and done the training. I've got a standing ovation for once, bizarrely. But just because they were so grateful that actually someone took the time out to come and inform them about this kind of stuff, because they had no idea. So that would have been an area they would have then gone in once they qualified and thought, I don't really know anything about it. And then they might behave the same. So, yeah, I think it's important.
So if people want to know more or develop their practice, whether they be psychological professionals, experts by experience like myself, or other stakeholders, what can they do?
I mean, you can look online, but you've got to be careful what you read online, because not all of it's true, as we know. I mean, I would first and foremost, if you're feeling de-skilled or disempowered as a professional person, you would be wanting to get some training. And I know I keep banging on about training, but I see people transform in the space. They come in really terrified or a little bit kind of, what's all this about, a bit skeptical.
and then they kind of almost skip out and say, actually, I'm going to go, I know who I'm going to ask someone their pronouns today, and I'm going to do this, and I'm going to actually think about, oh, I won't make that assumption when they walk in, and they leave a lot more alive than when they came in, you know, and that fear is dissipated. So I would say, you know, try to educate yourself however that feels comfortable to you, you know, and don't be afraid to go to a training or to go to, you know, something. Generally trainers are quite nice because they're not trying to be scary beings or anything, but I think and just create those spaces for those conversations. You know, it's as simple as finding space to have safe conversations. So you're not, you know, you want to be promoting psychological safety for staff, for patients, for people with lived experience. Like it's all about safety, isn't it? Because we, you know, we give people a voice, be an ally, but keep people safe as well.
You know, what's your experience? Is your experience generally that you're meeting with groups of staff who genuinely are interested to learn, or is that a bit of a mixed bag?
I think it depends if it's mandatory. So a few organisations, which I won't mention, but have made it mandatory, which is great on the one hand, but then you get people kind of coming in that are going to lose their bonus if they don't arrive and they don't want to be there, and that's when it's actually quite counterproductive, because they try to derail me or try to derail the session with their own beliefs, and it's usually just, you know, being anti-trans or anti-this or anti-that or whatever. You know, that's quite difficult to deal with, because I want to keep everybody safe in the space. And if one person is kind of gunning for me, and I know as soon as they come in, well, I was like, right, okay, here we go. But it doesn't happen very often. I think when it's not mandatory, I never get any problems, or very rarely get problems with anyone. But yeah, I think the organisations that are really up for it, you can tell the enthusiasm, and it builds as they go. Oh, we want to book the next training, and now we want to book some more training, and now we want all the staff, and now we want our exec team to go in, and you know, and they build and build and build, and it's just, I'm in awe of them. I think it's you know, it's amazing, and they come out and they say, right, we're gonna get a pathway together. It's like, oh, I've tried for years, good luck. Or you know, we're going to make changes, or we're going to do that, we're going to change the toilets. They go away very excited, and I think that's when I know that they are going to, you know, I'll drop them a line, or they'll book me later on the next year or something, and then you see their progress, and it is very awe-inspiring. I think it's brilliant.
How, I mean, there's room, I guess, and people out there will have different perspectives. There's room for people to feel both optimistic and pessimistic, I guess, about where we are and where we're headed. How do you feel, Jamie? Do you feel optimistic about where we're going in the NHS in this space? Or?
Well, I'm usually always an optimist rather than a pessimist. So I can see hope. I can see hope in our society, in our NHS, and the individuals within the NHS. I have faith in people. We are going through one step back, I would say, at the moment. You know, it's all very uncertain, and that's not just in the UK; it's across the world as well. So I think it's a little bit unknown at the moment where we're going forward. But we do have wonderful guidance, etc. It's very sparse, but we do have we've got the Equality Act 2010, we've got the Gender Recognition Act 2004. They're still in play. We don't know what they'll look like in a few years' time. It could do with kind of changing up a bit, making it a bit more secure, especially for non-binary people, but because non-binary people are not actually protected by the Equality Act at the moment. But so there's big changes that need to happen, but I think we need to hold on to, in this country, we do have some safety barriers. We do have, you know, we have these kind of there could be more, you know, we need some more kind of unified guidance, I think, in different strands of the LGBTQ community. But we are making good progress. So in our maternity services, they're kind of finding alternative languages, and you know, I think you have pockets of wonderfulness in the NHS, but that needs to be everywhere. Creating those opportunities for these kind of, you know, for LGBTQ identity, or for all minority groups to be thought about. You know, it's not all white middle class women with pearls in our twirling the pearls is what I'm trying to say. You know, we've moved on from that, and I think you know, we need to accept difference, we need to expect difference, and not just tolerate it but celebrate difference. And I think that's so important, because you know, that if you're just tolerating something, it's never going to kind of flourish and grow, and you know, but you've got to be curious and open and just supportive of anyone who comes through your doors, really. But for the core of it is to get yourself educated so that you feel empowered and you feel confident, and you don't hide away from situations, and you don't pass the trans person or the whoever over to somebody else, that you think, no, actually I can work with a human being, and I can I can think about the whole of them. I think you also got to think, you do some personal work, so kind of internal work, be thinking about what assumptions do I make, what expectations. Say an LGBTQ person walks towards you, what's your first assumption going to be about that person? Well, it could be all kinds of stereotypes you've got in there that you don't even realize you've got. So it's that kind of bit internal processing, that kind of reflection work, and then kind of thinking, okay, what are my belief systems? We all have belief systems, but what are they? Are you being inclusive with your belief systems? Were your belief systems handed down from generation to generation, or family, or from your communities? Is it your truth? And if not, if it's not inclusive, kind of wonder about, why am I thinking this? Why am I feeling this? What's that all about? So I think, especially in the psychological professions, you need to know where you're coming from, what your transference is going to be, counter transference, all that. It's very, very important. So do the kind of self work, and then do the kind of groundwork to work with others, I think, as well. And then you'll be a wonderful human being and an excellent professional person.
Massive thanks to Jamie for that conversation with us. I can't speak highly enough of Jamie's training, but also, their wisdom and thoughtfulness about these sorts of issues in general. I was looking, we've obviously got some questions coming up in the chat, which is in the Q&A rather, which is fantastic. I really noticed Phil's use of the word courage and bravery. Courage is exactly the word that I'd written down myself as I was kind of listening to that. I think what I've really taken in particular from Jamie is the role of fear, I suppose, and fear of getting things wrong, fear of not knowing what to do in promoting a sort of closing down and a non-engagement with some of these issues, and the importance then of, Jamie talks a lot about kindness in kind of promoting a safe space, giving people a safe place to actually engage with some of these issues. But I think there is something about courage and bravery in having the conversations, in laying things on the table, in perhaps pushing ourselves a little bit out of our comfort zones in some cases, in really learning about some aspects of people's experiences that might be really challenging to hear about, because they might go against how we think things ought to be working in the NHS. And I think that's so important that we tread into those spaces and we face up to those. So do keep bringing those questions in the Q&A. We're going to try and turn to those a little later. I wanted now to turn to our live guest, Allàn Laville. So Al is the Dean for Diversity and Inclusion and the Professor of Equity in Psychology, both of which sound to me incredibly impressive titles, from the University of Reading. And we, slightly dauntingly, for Beth and I, who now have to play a more active role than we might have hoped to do at this point, we agreed that rather than just kind of I'll come and give a presentation, we'd have a bit of a conversation together about some of these issues. So we're going to do that, and then we'll come across to the Q&A at the end. So, I mean, we've seen those videos, which I suppose highlight the real access issues that people face. What's your take on what you've seen, and how does that kind of link with your experience and the work you've been doing?
Yeah, there's a lot across both videos actually, which really resonated with the work that I've been doing. And I think before I launch into that, I think it's important to say that I identify as bi myself. So even though I'm a psychological professional, I also identify as bi and also have lived experience mental health too. So some of the work that we've done very much comes from, I say we as in me and my students, our own lived experiences. But the access issues we found, one that came up again and again, is the fear, the worry of a lack of understanding when, if you do access support, that the practitioner won't understand your unique lived experiences, and more broadly won't understand sexual and gender diversity. And I think that's been reflected today too. And when speaking to practitioners, it often comes up saying, well, I'm inclusive, fabulous, that's brilliant, but how would potential individuals know to access a service and how inclusive the service is. So I think it came up in the first video about what is there. So if you go onto a website, what is there around equality, diversity and inclusion statement? What is there around LGBTQIA plus training or allyship? Is there any form of visible inclusion in terms of the community from a website? And then is that reflected when you're accessing a service in terms of lanyards or in posters in waiting spaces? And even though some of that can sound quite small, from speaking to people with lived experiences, and to some extent I feel it myself, when someone is wearing an LGBTQI plus lanyard or rainbow badge, immediately there's that signal of, I'm going to be understood to some extent here, and feel more relaxed instantly. So I think those type of visible signs can make a big difference. And often it's not really thought about. I think people, as Jamie shared, in the NHS, you know there's going to be caring people, well-meaning people in the main, for sure. But again, what gives you that reassurance, particularly if you've had negative experiences before, which many of us have had? I think you lose faith in the psychological professions.
It's sort of recognizing, I suppose, that, I suppose like Jamie was referring to there with the young people they were speaking to, you know, the sense that actually you might have a real uphill battle on your hands to actually demonstrate, you know, that you are ready to listen perhaps in a different way. And the importance of those, like you say, in a sense, they're small things, but actually they're really big things, I guess. If you're arriving in a waiting room and you see some sign that gives you some hope that actually there's an active demonstration here of openness. I mean, I suppose the other thing is about the training issue, and Al, I know you've done a lot of work specifically on kind of training for people working in the psychological professions. Do you want to tell us a bit about the context of that work?
Yeah, sure. So that's training that I created in 2011, and that was very much through my own research interests and my own lived experience. And in 2011, I was focusing on sexual orientation. The last 5-6 years, I've completed research and training that looks at the community as a whole, as best as you can do in half a day. But for me, I guess the key elements are there, and again, it's reflected in the earlier videos, but do you feel listened to? We've got a case study vignette that Josh is their name in the vignette, and they're bi, and they're sharing a lot about their identity with their practitioner. And there's one response from the practitioner that, well, these are usually good resources for someone who's gay. The practitioner's not listening, they're rushing, they may feel uncomfortable with the conversation, they may feel, oh, actually, I'm not really sure how to manage this, or how to respond to the patient, or how to explore their experiences with them. So you find, from a place of almost panic and worry, you see this rushed action planning, an inappropriate rushed action planning. So we thought, we in terms of people that I've worked with collaboratively in the research space, but in terms of the training specifically, around how can we improve awareness and understanding. And I think a lot of that in the training is, as you did, Bill, at the beginning today, why are we having this conversation? And I've had some people say to my face, in the training, we have equality now. I almost laugh because we know hate crimes have more than doubled in the last 5-6 years in the UK, and lots of other facts and figures that were mentioned earlier. But I think when you take a step back, and I have to remove my lived experience and the emotional bit of me from it for a second, I think there's something really interesting in those comments where it's like, okay, there's a perception from often heterosexual cis individuals, not exclusively, but often, that we've reached equality. And we have improved somewhat in the UK, but actually there's a lot more to do. And I think aligning that cultural, social, political context with the prevalence of mental health and risk rates in the community, why is that the case? Going back to prejudice and discrimination, but then looking at later in the training about, only a third in, what can we do to improve our practice? And that's where I've really focused in the last few years about principles to improve inclusive practice.
So what can you expect, like, from the actual training? Like, what exactly is included in the training that you provide?
So the first bit is very much looking at the government survey in 2018 that 108,000 members of our community took part in, one of the biggest surveys I've ever seen. And I think that's really powerful for a number of reasons, in that it shows I think 68% of individuals are worried about holding hands with a same-sex partner due to negative fear of reaction from others. Around 40% of individuals were a victim of a hate crime in the 12 months preceding the survey. And it also covers the abhorrent, harmful often torturous conversion therapy practice as well, to really set the scene that, unfortunately, as we know, the King's Speech was recent, wasn't it? Wasn't included, and it's very topical issues. We covered that. Why are we having this conversation today? Why is it important? And a lot of people that have come to the training have said, actually, there's a lot of things that I haven't thought about before. And it really opened my eyes to why I need to care. And I respect that honesty, where people are saying, actually, I've looked within myself, I've looked within my assumptions and biases, and I'm actively challenging them. Then we look at the impact of the pandemic on the community, often underreported. I published a piece almost 2 years ago on that. And thinking about, what do we know clinically? Well, we know that recovery rates within the community are worse than for heterosexual cisgender individuals. We know that having conversations with therapists is very mixed. Sometimes sexual and gender identity isn't even mentioned. Often people feel therefore uncomfortable raising these topics with their therapist. And then we also spend some time about, what does good look like? So part of that, as we mentioned earlier, around holistic care, listening, inclusive language. Part of that's around thinking about what work, if someone's accessing for support, for example, they're having difficulties at work, but there's also considerations around their identity. What work can you do? Say in my immediate area, so as a CBT therapist, but what organisations may also be useful to support an individual more broadly, and also looking at barriers to being able to take that work forward, both the work you're taking forward with the individual and the other organisations. So you're going back again to that holistic picture. And also in the training, we look at case scenarios. So often people like to pull all of that together and think, what does that actually look like though in practice? We've learned lots of principles and themes of what good looks like, but how can I apply that to my practice? So we spend quite a bit of time on that too.
And I know that in that training, there's you particularly use the Mayor's kind of minority stress model as a way of kind of looking at some of these issues. So I don't know if we can bring that up on screen so people can see that, and perhaps you could tell us a bit about how that's useful in terms of the kind of training and the work that you're doing with people.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is very much, as I alluded to, about bringing it all together. So the reason, if we look at the second half of the model here, so this is Mayor's minority stress model. It's published in 2003 and it comes from social psychology, but I have applied it to clinical formulation and it works really well for my practice. And I've actually seen some recent papers that have been applying this Mayor's model, probably in a slightly different way to me, to group work and individual work with the community. But looking at the second half at the bottom of the slide, often what I found in my experience and speaking to individuals, and we've seen and heard today, it's I'm worried about saying the wrong thing, so I won't say anything at all. So a lot of it is around inclusive language, reflecting the individual that you're working with, their language. What do you know about someone's minority identity? What have they shared? What in addition have they shared? So this could be around historic bullying, for example. So Josh, the case study we focus on, is facing significant difficulties at work, but also he's been with his partner Matt for 4 years. He's struggling to come out to his parents. He doesn't know what to do next. And there is a lot around, sometimes people feel that good allyship looks like, oh yeah, everyone should come out. But actually we need to take that step back and think there may be historic bullying, harassment, discrimination, in some form, likely, unfortunately. And are there barriers to coming out, again, rather than rushing? We also need to think around previous experiences and current experiences in relation to someone's identity and how that may influence mental health outcomes. So we know that due to discrimination, prejudice and bullying often results in a range of mental health conditions. And I'm encouraged, due to my own lived experiences of complex trauma, to see more researchers focusing on actually and broadly looking at, but then specifically drilling into the impact of homophobia, biphobia and transphobia in relation to trauma. And I think it's about time people focus on this, because often things are passed off as microaggressions, they're under the radar, they're minor, but actually no, they're having significant impacts on individuals' well-being. And then looking at the top half of that model, we're not ignoring the other experiences that Josh is going through. So we are thinking about the difficulties at work in terms of the circumstances in the environment. We are thinking around, if you've always got that, I see it as background worry, stress, maybe low mood, that's going to impact how you can cope with other general stresses in your day-to-day life. And what we know from the literature is that as mentioned in the video earlier, first video, an accumulation of daily stresses, microaggressions, prejudice, discrimination, etc., can be have a greater impact on individuals than a significant life event. So sometimes we're sitting back and thinking, oh, well, there's nothing significant that's happened to me. But there's actually all these daily stresses, which may seem quite minor, and our circumstances in the environment, and considering minority identity. And I think what we do well in the psychological professions, and it's relevant here according to Mayer's model too, is thinking about substance use in the community and how that may mediate mental health, but also looking at social support. So I'm a big advocate of sometimes when we're looking at signposting, it's not to say, go over to this service. What it is saying is actually we may have some really good support generally in our lives, but we may want to speak to other people like buddying or peer support, socialising people like experiences, which a lot of external organisations do, often charitable organisations. So that's, in a nutshell, in a very brief version, how we'd pull that together, and we'd come to this point after about 2.5 hours, covering all the other key bits we mentioned briefly.
Again, it's the kind of occupational hazard of the 90-minute kind of slot that we're trying to cover a lot of ground here. I think it's a fantastic summary of a really complex bit of work. I think what I think is really important, I guess, about this model, and I think it's a more general development in our understanding of how difference and diversity actually impacts people's lived experiences, thinking about then what does that experience of facing that sort of discrimination, what does that then do to you? How does that, how is that a form of trauma that we need to understand? And I think that historically just hasn't really been on the table for discussion. And I think having models in which we can actually ask about that and understand that seems to me really, really important in kind of deepening our ability to understand actually, what does what does lived experience actually look like, and how can we talk about that in a more systematic way and understand what it means to someone, and also I guess get people to think for themselves, well, actually, how has that impacted on me? I think sometimes it's easy for individuals to minimize the impact these things can have on them.
Absolutely, and I think it's often with people that I've worked with and people that I know personally, often with the internalised homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, you can very much have an impact on your self-esteem. I think Jamie mentioned it. Where there's those instilled beliefs, actually, is this my belief system, or is it one that's been instilled in me? So, for example, I unfortunately grew up with one quite homophobic, biphobic parent, and you sort of look at yourself through that lens of I shouldn't be thinking and feeling in this way. And it does affect your mood, does affect your anxiety, can result in complex trauma. So that is really crucial, both for your own lived experiences, but also if you're a practitioner, as Jamie said really well, and we found this one of our recommendations in our 2019 paper, take that step back. What assumptions are you making? What heteronormative assumptions or cisnormative assumptions are you making? What biases do you hold? And I always get really worried when someone says, I don't have any biases at all. I think, oh, really? You don't have any biases, and you've never identified any biases, and you've never had to work for any biases. Sure, okay. But I think that is part of that courage. Is it maybe uncomfortable to take that step back and think of your biases, but it's necessary.
Yes, and I think that's right. I think that is an area where those ideas of courage and bravery are important, because I think, certainly if I look back to, my upbringing and some of the attitudes that were around me, there were a lot of homophobic attitudes around me. As a kind of teenager, I probably bought into some of those myself. I think that's a reality, and I think unless we can talk about that openly and think about how that's had an impact on us, I think it holds us back. But I'm keen we talk about some Q&As, because we've got lots of things here now. Blimey, we've got a lot of different things we could talk about. So do the two of you have a look yourselves and see if you've got any thoughts about what we could respond to. I was going to start with Kate Standing, who had said, I wonder how we can solve the obstacle of professions almost feeling scared to get things wrong, and so avoiding topics and not seeking to learn. Kate says she's got her own experience of trying to teach colleagues because they're feeling daunted by things like non-binary pronouns, but kind of are scared to ask and scared to get things wrong. That's something we've touched on today, but I don't know, Al or Beth, if you've got any other thoughts on that.
I think it's very much, I've heard something used by another person which works well, is that it's okay to make a mistake, but then you need to learn from that mistake. So I think that facilitates that open sharing. So what we do in our training sessions is I always bring in my own lived experience. Almost always someone else in the group brings in their lived experience. And I think by doing so, we step away from just content, which some people may see more as theoretical and abstract, and actually looking at the lived experience and the impact on individuals. And I think when people are, again, you need to have that safe space, but when you're bringing in lived experiences, I think you can then ask those questions, or I openly say, you can ask me those questions that you probably wouldn't ask someone else, or maybe worried to ask. Let's have this open space. And that works quite well, because I feel that if people come into a space where, and I've experienced it before, where someone might be a significant advocate for an area of equality, diversity and inclusion, but it feels like there's not even that space to ask or get something wrong. So I think allowing that, enabling that, but also being mindful of our language is really useful. So I found that's a balance that's worked quite well.
Beth,
Yeah,
I
was going to say, I agree. And I think sort of like the barriers around people feeling scared, it's sort of just breaking down that, you know, again, it's okay to make a mistake, but learn from it, reflect. And if you are sort of, if you are called out on it by an individual, being able to sort of, you know, get people more comfortable with accepting that and taking that on board and being like, okay, I need to reassess here. But also keeping in mind, you know, everybody is different. As Eleanor put it, you meet one trans person, you've met a trans person, you haven't met all of them. You meet a, you know, gay person, you haven't met all gay people. So there are going to be people who are more sensitive to some things that others don't care about. But it is ultimately just approaching, I think, with a sense of empathy and just like curiosity that, you know, isn't othering, but sort of, you know, say it can be just as simple as, you know, asking someone, you know, what are your pronouns? And, you know, if you know, once they've told you, you know, taking that on, and even though it can be quite difficult to change that language, making sure to correct yourself if you do slip up. And, you know, just really doing that work. And yeah, it's like not being afraid to be told off if you are, but if you do make a mistake, it's, I know it's quite daunting. But ultimately, yeah, just empathy and openness and just, yeah, being sort of, I guess, willing to be like, I don't understand this necessarily, but I'm open to learning. I'm taking it on board. Take notes if you need to, you know, that sort of thing.
And that seems to chime with, there's a kind of comment, almost more than a question, in the chat from Bethany Duncan saying, what I'm hearing is a large part of the work isn't necessarily getting a complex intervention or model. It's about professionals getting comfortable with being uncomfortable. So that seems like that's speaking to what we're saying here. It's about the courage to go into that space and take some risks. Obviously, the safety about setting up that space so that people can come in and take risks, and both of those things being important. I'm going to turn then to, now let me see, I can't read the name. Is that Christopher? I can't see the end of the name. Christopher O'Rourke. I might be pronouncing that wrong, and apologies if I am. What are people's thoughts on the reasons for low recovery and reliable improvement rates for the LGBTQIA plus communities? It's something you referred to, Al. I know you have done some work on it. I don't know if you want to say something. That's a more specific sort of question.
Yeah, sure. So this is a finding that the paper is often referred to as a Feuertel paper from 2019, but essentially looking at low recovery rates. If you drill down into that data, you find lower recovery rates for bisexual individuals, male and female, and also lesbian women. And my feeling, and this is just a feeling, is that it's very much the lack of holistic care. And I also think it's the lack of understanding and awareness. So if someone is bringing themselves into that space, there's two parts to it. If they're bringing themselves into that space, is there that understanding and awareness? Does that practitioner have that knowledge? Are they engaging in holistic care? Or as we heard on the videos, is it very tick boxy? You know, I'm working on anxiety and depression, that's it. I think the other part of it is if you're filtering yourself and only bringing part of you into that therapy space, that's surely going to have an impact on reliable outcomes as well. So that's where I feel, again, it's linked to the training, that if people are, and what people have reported, and I'll be very blunt, if people are receiving quite shoddy care because they don't feel they can bring themselves in, they haven't been listened to, I think those principles would be relevant for anyone accessing care where they feel part of them has been ignored and not considered.
Thanks, Alan. I think that that's certainly helpful for me. It's something, I would recognise there's more I could learn about actually those particular kind of differences between different kind of subgroups in the community. So it's an interesting jumping off point, I suppose, for me to learn more about that. I'm really mindful about time. So I've noticed there's a really good question, which I'm not going to attempt to answer because I think it's super complicated, from Hannah Farndon about the extent to which we see LGBT plus kind of data about diversity, as well as we might see data about some other areas of difference. I think that's a really interesting challenge in a way. I know that at trust level in our workforce data, often there's all sorts of issues about underreporting and questions about whether people actually feel safe to report their sexuality and gender identity. So we tend to be much better at picking up on race, for instance, although still not as good as we might be. But, and I think that probably is part of the picture, but there's probably a more complicated picture behind that. What I was going to finish on is a big question, so good, but I think a really important one coming from Jemima Judge, who kind of starts off by saying, look, there's so much kind of transphobic negative sort of narratives and discourse around us. How can they support their clients? And they're saying they're working with children and young people, clients' mental health, and what can we do as a system? So I suppose it's a more general sense, what can we do to kind of resist some of those toxic narratives that we see around us?
Yeah.
I think with that, if you don't mind me inserting,
go ahead. Yeah.
As a system, it's sort of like, looking into that training from like, whether it's, Jamie Willo's, if it's Allann's, if it's anybody else's, like other places that are offering these trainings, because there are multiple places offering training, wherever you can find it, if it seems like, especially if it's coming from individuals of that, demographic, so from our community, is really helpful. So yeah, as a system, looking into those sorts of training things. But as an individual, just listening, and again, that compassion, being essentially a safe person. I don't think people realize how important having a safe person is. But when you've got that person, even in a world where you're feeling attacked from all sides, when you've got that one person, especially if they're a care provider, who has done the work to understand, they've looked up everything that's going on, they understand that it's really difficult, and they're just there being empathetic and listening to you and saying, I'm here for you, and you can't change the government, unfortunately, like as one person, but still showing that you support them, and that at the end of the day it's not just all bad. There's still good in the world, and there's still places that will support them. I think that's one very important way, especially when it comes to children and young people, showing that they're not alone, and that even people in positions that are giving them care will provide them with that important support and empathy.
Thank you, Beth. Al, I mean, this is almost getting to kind of final thoughts as well, so I don't know what you'd like to say to us.
Yeah, I very much agree with what Beth shared, and I think that for me there's that components around, if you're looking at systemic injustice, I think it's very much looking at services and looking at developing inclusive practice within services, and training may be one way to acknowledging that. Also, I'm a big advocate of using clinical supervision to further and develop learning and discussions, and if that's set up well, that's an additional safe spaces for individuals to continue to say, actually, I'm doing this casework, this is what's worked well for me or not so well, what does that look like? And very much as Beth said around the empathy, I think a lot of the work that I map onto in terms of Mayor's approach is actually it's saying, hey, it's not you, it's the discrimination, prejudice, bullying and harassment in society, and thinking around the being listened to and the impact that abuse, as I will use that word, abuse has had on you as an individual, and the practitioner supporting accordingly. We found from listening to lived experiences, often people feel that their sexuality or gender identity is misunderstood, disregarded, not accepted, and that's going to just make things even worse, right? So I think it's going back again to the practitioner and maybe some of the learning and training there.
I think, that makes a massive amount of sense to me, Alan. I think that general sense of moving from pathologizing experience to actually saying, look, in the context you're in and faced with what you're facing, what you're experiencing is completely understandable and normal and expectable, and you need help and support to work your way through that, really is a massive part of what we should be offering as psychological professionals overall in lots and lots of different settings. But look, it's 11:01. We've come to the end of our time today. I hope that those of you who've been with us have enjoyed the session as much as we've enjoyed putting it together. My thanks to Al for joining us here, to Beth for the instigation of this event and the idea behind it, and then taking such an active part in it. And I know that that's been a real journey for you, Beth, but it's so fantastic to have you up here on the virtual stage with us all for the event. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you for the comments in the Q&A. I'm sure we haven't done justice to all of them. I see some further chat about data issues. So it sounds like there's some really knowledgeable people out there. Do check out the PPN Week website. There's other events coming up later in the week. I'm not entirely sure how open bookings are, but there's definitely a chance to check those out and to check out recordings of those events. We've got another face-to-face equality, diversity and inclusion event in the Southeast PPN coming up in February. Those of you who are members will perhaps already have seen some information about that. Do come and join us in person. We're hoping that we'll have some material about these issues, LGBTQIA plus issues. We're hoping we're going to rope Al into that event. So we hope to see those of you who can join us there. Check out on our PPN Southeast website, we've got our EDI resource bank that Margot and colleagues have put together, and that's got some great resources around working with the LGBTQIA plus community. We'll be sending you out some evaluation forms, so please do fill those in. We really will look at the information that we get back from those. I'm being nudged by my WhatsApp group here, mention the Q&A form, so I've mentioned the Q&A form now. Thank you all very, very much. It's been great to have you with us today. Yeah, all our best wishes for Psychological Professions Week and Trans Awareness Week to everybody out there. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everyone.